Hi everyone, I'm Safia.
And I'm Stefan, and we're here to talk to you about how to make the most of minimal APIs in .NET 7. As a bit of an agenda, we're going to talk about the new endpoint filters, route groups, some improvements we made to Auth, new concept called endpoint metadata providers, and general improvements we made to testing. So to kick things off, Safia is going to show off some endpoint filters right now.
Amazing. Cool. So I'm going to hop into my editor here. One of the things that we were tasked with, Stefan, was building a training API for a local gym. Now, this API is pretty simple. We want to be able to manage personal trainers who work at the gym and clients who attend the gym. So we've been working hard on this API. We've got all of the endpoints associated with our application here. You can see all of the client-related routes up here, and we've got all the trainer-related routes down at the bottom. Now, one of the things I was tasked with was adding support for logging in our application. And I want to take advantage of a new feature in .NET 7 to add the support, specifically endpoint filters. Endpoint filters allow you to introspect the parameters that are sent to a particular request, process them as you might see fit, modify them, and also intercept the responses that are emitted from a particular endpoint. In this particular scenario, I've implemented this request auditor endpoint filter. It's a pretty basic filter. It's going to take a look at the current path that is being requested and simply log it to my logger. One of the things we'll notice is that these endpoint filter factories have access to application services. So we can access things that are in DI. Here, I'm accessing the logger factory to support logging in my filter. We'll also notice that they have access to this endpoint invocation context concept. This allows me to access the parameters that are being sent to my requests, as well as the HTTP context. Here, I'm using that to get the request and the path associated with my application. So what I expect to happen here is that every time a user hits an endpoint in my application that has the filter registered, this logic will execute. But how do I register this filter? Great point. We're going to scroll up to one of our endpoints here. We've got our client's ID endpoint with this get method. And you'll notice that I'm invoking the add endpoint filter factory method to register the request auditor factory that I just showed you. So let's go ahead and see this in action. I'm going to go ahead and run my application. And we're going to observe two things happening. First, we've hit a breakpoint in the factory associated with our filters. Filter factories are functions that return filter delegates. Here we can see that the factory is invoked once when we start our application. We're using it in this case to access the DI container and get the logger factory. If I hit continue, we'll notice that it's invoked every time a filter is registered in our endpoints. That's an interesting point to capture, and it's going to touch on something we're going to show you in just a bit. For now, I'll continue through. Once our application has launched, we can go ahead and test our actual filter. We'll do that by issuing a call to the client's ID endpoint. So we'll try it out, pass an ID, 1 for example, and hit execute. We've jumped back into our editor because our filter has been invoked now. And we'll notice that we're able to inspect the path that the request was sent to. Here you can see that it's being sent to the client's 1 path. That's the ID that was just emitted. So this is going to go ahead and log that message out in my console. So we're going to go ahead and continue. One thing I'm noticing, Stefan, is that I want this request auditor filter applied on a bunch of the endpoints in our application. So I want it on all the trainer routes, I want it on all the client-based routes, but I'm finding that I keep having to call add endpoint filter factory on every endpoint, and it's getting a little tedious. Do you have something that could help me with that?
All right, yeah, I think we do. And this is going to bring us to a new feature in .NET 7 called route groups. One of the feedback or a piece of feedback that we got in .NET 6 regarding minimal APIs is that there's a lot of repetition. In some cases, when you say need to add a filter to a bunch of endpoints or add, say, something like an attribute. With MVC controllers, you can add an attribute to an entire class, and that can keep your code more dry, right? So you're not repeating yourself. So if we take a quick look at this new version of Program CS, you'll see that we have this method that we're calling called map group. And this map group method returns what's known as a route group builder. So it's taking a route pattern. One thing you'll notice here really quickly is that we're not just taking a prefix that's static, we're taking a route value. That's the ID. This can be done in a group. You can even apply a group to your entire app with like an empty string that's allowed. So a route group builder is something that allows you to both call methods like mapGet, mapPost, and mapController if you want to. So any number of ways to add endpoints, map razor pages. And it also implements this maybe lesser known interface called the Endpoint convention builder, which then allows you to do things like add filters to a bunch of endpoints at once. So in this case, I took your example with the request auditor, and I'm applying it to every endpoint that's for clients. So if we try it out, right, you see that here we just pass in an empty pattern. For what it's worth, that's equivalent to doing this as well. We kind of, when we're merging groups, we always separate with a path separator. And let's see how it goes, right? So the idea here is since we take this return value, this route group, we're adding these endpoints not to app, but to clients, which is now based off this app. So you're just appending client's ID, and then in this case, nothing. And let's take a real quick look. So if we look at the Swagger output, we'll refresh, and we can make a request to, say, client ID 1. And hopefully, if we then look, we get a 200 response. And if we look at our console output, the request auditor ran.
Awesome.
This is a new feature in .NET 7. We're super excited to get your feedback on. One notably missing feature from this is you cannot add middleware. So for instance, if you want to call something like use authentication, use authorization, you still have to call that on the entire app and not just a group. The idea there is that you can use the metadata, right? So if you have middleware that is so-called endpoint aware, like authorization, you can look at the metadata added to the group via something like require authorization and so forth, and apply middleware selectively that way, even though you can't add middleware directly to a group. It's something we've considered, so we'd love your feedback on. Now, I've teased authorization a little. We didn't go into that super heavily, but that's another thing we've improved in .NET 7.
Yeah, I was actually just hoping to share some things about that. If we hop over to my window, I want to show you some of the things we did in .NET 7 to make working with authentication and authorization a little bit easier. First things first, I've enabled job bearer-based authentication in my application with this line call that we see here. Now, one thing you'll notice is that we are not passing a default scheme to the add authentication call. That's because we made a change in .NET 7 so that if you have only registered a single authentication schemes, which is what I've done here, I only have job bearer-based auth enabled, that will be assumed as the default. So we save you a little bit of typing. If it's only one, it's assumed as the default. We've also made some improvements to the process for constructing authorization policies. There's a new extension method on services called Add Authorization Builder. When you invoke this method, not only will authorization services be registered in DI, you'll also get an authorization builder that you can construct policies on directly. So I'm using that here to construct the trainer access policy that we're going to use to lock down our trainer-related endpoints to admins. So that's step one. We've defined our authentication and our authorization policies. Now, I want to make the experience for testing authorization locally a little bit simpler. And I want to do that by leveraging some of the authentication integrations that exist in OpenAPI. Now, if you notice, if we head over to our OpenAPI page, we've got this lock icon in the top right corner, and we've got endpoints with lock icons on each route. So how did we get that working? Let's take a look. First, the fact that we were able to infer that authorization is enabled globally for our application is because of support for the new Infer Security Schemes option in Swashbuckled's generator options. So I've set it here to true. What will happen is if we detect that there's a job bearer authentication option in our application, we'll automatically generate the OpenAPI metadata required to show that authorization button in our UI. Now, that just configures authentication globally in the application. It says, hey, there's endpoints here that need auth. But it doesn't configure the fact that individual endpoints need to be lit up with auth. To do that, I've implemented an extension method called Enable OpenAPI Authentication that leverages the new with OpenAPI extension method that we released in .NET 7 to add the security scheme definition for individual endpoints that require authorization. So with those 3 steps and a little bit of magic inference, we're able to get the authorization working in all the places I need it. Now at that point, what I want to be able to do is present tokens to the authorization provider. How do I do that? We teased this a little bit earlier in the keynote, but we want to leverage the new .NET UserJots tool to generate tokens locally for testing. Now, what's great about the .NET UserJots tool is it supports a ton of different customizations. Based on what kinds of claims, scopes, and roles your application is configured to accept, you can create tokens that either match those requirements or don't match them if you want to test how resilient your application is to invalid tokens. So what I've done here is I've generated a token that matches the policy that is expected by my application. My policy, as a reminder, expects us to have a role trainer and a claim that says we have admin permissions on the application. And I get a token that's generated with this particular information. Now here we go. I can copy the token over into my Swagger UI and be able to test some of the endpoints in my application that require authorization, such as the getTrainers endpoint. So let's try this out. We'll hit execute. We hit our logger endpoint. Trusty, good to know that we're doing the right things. And one of the things we'll notice is that the authorization token has been passed in as part of the header to the request. And our authorization middleware is able to validate that token and assert that the claims and scopes and roles that are configured on it are correct or incorrect. In this case, we provided a valid token. So we get a 200 response with an XML response body. That's interesting. We kind of talked about XML results at last year's .NET Conf. Looks like we were able to do it here. Stefan, do you want to share how we were able to get that working?
Yeah, so last year when we were moonlighting for Contoso Construction, we created an XML result, but it didn't give us that nice Swagger output that actually told you it would be XML. So you could, using groups, let's say that like all these trainer endpoints were XML, they're not, but let's say they were. You could do like produces response, or with various, don't have the IntelliSense, but you can add response type metadata to an entire group manually. But if we take a real quick look at this getTrainers service, we'll see that we're returning this XML result type that we created last year in .NET Conf, but with a new addition. So we're using the extension method syntax to make it super easy. We, like we showed last year, watch. I unfortunately can't rehash it all, but who knows, maybe if we have time and questions. But this is basically for just a quick refresh, implementing iResult. So those of you who are familiar with MVC, this is very similar to action result. You can basically party on an HTTP context and write whatever you want directly to HTTP context response.body. And that's what we do right here with the XML serializer. What's new in .NET 7 is this Endpoint metadata provider. This is taking advantage of a new C# feature, which are static abstract interfaces. I think they're super cool. When I first heard it, it's like, how can it be both static and abstract? And what it really comes down to is basically when you're using something like generics, or when you know the type at build time, you can basically call these static methods to infer, in this case, additional metadata about the endpoint. So what we're going to say when we call this static populate metadata method is that we have XML response type metadata, which will, 200 status code, sets application XML response type. And then in minimal APIs, we will discover any return value or parameter value that implements Endpoint metadata provider, or there's also for parameters. So if we take a quick look again, we were just looking at this. This is providing you with the method info. So this is, the reflection API that can give you all the parameters to your route handler, as we call it, right? So that in this case would be this get trainers method is our route handler, and this is returning our XML result. This is not really the main point of this talk, but this is using a new results kind of union type.
Nice.
And this is important because we could change this service and it would be valid to be like, we return an iResult. And this will work at runtime. But then we're going to lose all that Swagger metadata because our analysis is based on minimal APIs being able to observe that, hey, we can return an XML result, which we know is application XML based on that produces metadata, or not found, right, which is a 404. Additionally, if you're using like a parameter, if we take a quick look at XML result, there is one other similar type. It's Endpoint parameter metadata provider. So if you're like implementing try, parse, or bind async, we're not going to go over that again, though those are now also static abstract interface methods if you want them to be. You can get the parameter info. So you can specifically say the name of your parameter if that's important to like how you're binding. You can take advantage of that, and then you can populate the metadata. So let's get this back to building. I actually do have it running already in the background from before.
Nice.
So let's see. Let's go. I'm going to have to, hopefully I didn't copy anything, using the user JOTS tool, which is super convenient for testing. We got to authorize this endpoint because you remember that we used the group to basically require authorization for every single thing, right? And this basically allows us to avoid repeating this a bunch of times. So now that we have that set up, hopefully, it will show us that it expects XML, like Safia, wait, not the post, the get. We didn't do all of them. It expects the XML.
Nice.
And then now that we have the auth set up, hopefully we don't get a 401. And we do not.
That looks right. Awesome.
Yeah. So super exciting. And just like an FYI, before we hand off to talk about some super cool testing improvements, like this is the equivalent to doing new authorized attribute. Okay, I just tried this earlier. All right, this is what I get for doing any kind of live coding. Trainer access, right? So this is equivalent. This is basically adding an authorized attribute to the entire group, but we have the convenience method for you. But anyway, I've now written all this stuff. I tested it manually using user JOTS and stuff with Swagger. But I mean, I'm a good software developer. So I mean, automated testing is a must, right?
Yes. I appreciate that you're a great software developer, Stefan.
I try to be.
And I agree, automated testing is a must. So let's hop into my editor here, and I'll show you a little bit of what we've done for .NET 7 to improve testing. Now, this is also a callback to our .NET 6 minimal APIs talk, where we showcased that unit testing minimal API-based applications could get a little rough sometimes because you did not have access to the results types that your application could return. So for example, if your application returned a created result or a no content result, there was no way to assert on that because the types were not public. That was something that we improved in .NET 7.
Good feedback from the community, too.
Yes, that was based on community feedback. And it was something that we improved in .NET 7. So we're always looking to iterate and refine the experience for working with minimal APIs. So what can you do now that you couldn't do before? Well, here's an example. I've got a training service which encapsulates the business logic associated with my application. I'm invoking it here with a mocked database context. I'm going to go ahead and send a request to the create client handler. This is the handler that gets invoked when the user sends a post to the client's route. Now, one of the things you'll notice is I'm actually able to do an assert.isType invocation using my unit testing library to confirm that the result that I get out of my API is the created type. Now my typed result here is cast appropriately, and I can inspect the status code to make sure that it's correct, which is, a 201 status code. And I can also examine the value that's returned as part of that result, which is the client that was created, which I've provided as part of my data here. So we can run this test, and it will work. We have access to all of the types that are needed to provide these assertions.
Confident.
Yes, it went green. I love seeing green. It's one of the most satisfying things. One of the other approaches that still works in .NET 7 is integration testing using the Web Application Factory. So I've showcased this strategy here for the Get Clients endpoint. You can see here that I'm able to instantiate a new API application. This is just an instance of an implementer of the Web Application Factory API. We can go and check that out here and see that we're implementing the Web Application Factory and providing all of the necessary configurations. We get an HTTP client out of our Web Application Factory that we can then use to query the API. So here I am sending a GET call to the client's endpoint. And, I can go ahead and read the response body if I wanted to assert that, I get the correct JSON. I can even serialize this or deserialize it and assert that the content is what I expect, in this case, a client object. And of course, I can check on the status code since this is just your plain old HTTP response. So this is pretty neat. The fact that we improved being able to inspect results in .NET 7 means that writing unit tests is a lot easier, so we can have confidence in the API we just built. And integration tests are just another layer of robustness that we can have in the testing experience. So I would say that was a pretty good rundown of what is in .NET 7 for minimal APIs, right, Stefan?
I think so.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. And do we have time for questions?
It's on all sides up.
All right. So thanks. Sorry. So super excited.
We've been told to riff, which is great. So how can you engage with some of the stuff that we just shared here today? There is a link up behind us that Stefan made, which is where you can see the code for this demo. I know there's a lot of code that gets shown in these talks, so go and check out aka.ms/ASP.NET/MinAPI demo 2022, and you'll find the code that we were just perusing through.
To be clear, I just created the shortened link. Safia created the repo.
Yes. And if you want to learn more about minimal APIs, you can check out the learn.microsoft.com page on minimal.